afternoon. Well, thank you very much for inviting me here to speak with you. As Linus explained, my name is Erica Hope and I work for an organisation called Climate Action Network in Brussels, which is an international network of environmental organisations that work on climate and energy. Should I start again?
Yeah.
So I work for Climate Action Network, which is an international umbrella organisation for civil society organisations, NGOs, working on climate and energy. It first started in the context of the UN negotiations for an international agreement on climate change, but now we have a lot of regional organisations, nodes, like CAN Europe and CAN US and CAN Canada, who focus also on regional policy for their area. So CAN Europe itself has about 145 different environmental NGOs as its members, including big groups like Greenpeace and WWF and Friends of the Earth, and also many smaller organisations right across Europe. So today I am first going to just explain why, as an environmental organisation, we are interested in energy efficiency and savings. And then I will explain a little bit about what the EU has done in the past to try and encourage investment in energy efficiency, and also talk a bit about the new directive that I think many of you will be aware the EU has just agreed for energy efficiency. Then I'll say a little bit about what we're expecting to see from it and what the next steps are with how to implement it and how it provides an opportunity. And then finally I'll say a little bit about residential retrofits and programmes to achieve those, if we have time. So, first of all, as a climate organisation, the reason in particular why we are interested in energy efficiency and savings is the potential they have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, with our energy system being very largely based on fossil fuels, if you reduce how much energy you use, you reduce how much emissions you are producing. And given the scientific imperative to avoid climate change of more than 2 degrees, that's the sort of internationally agreed goal. The EU's fair share of the emission reductions needed to avoid that temperature increase is 80 to 95% reduction in emissions by 2050. And EU heads of state have agreed that the EU will endeavour to achieve this amount of reductions. Obviously, 80 to 95% reduction in emissions is huge, is absolutely massive, and going to be potentially very expensive, very difficult, and will require some big changes in the way we organise our economies. But obviously we want to use the most cost-effective ways to do it, and energy efficiency and savings are actually, for the most part, by far the cheapest and most effective way to achieve those emissions reductions. And it's estimated that they could actually achieve half of the needed emission reductions by 2050. So, with that in mind, the EU adopted in 2007 a target to reduce its energy use by 20%. As you may be aware, at the same time it also, by 2020, lots of 20s, it also adopted a target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% by 2020, and also to have 20% of its final energy needs from renewables by 2020. So it has these 3 targets, and the emissions reduction target is legally binding, and the renewable energy target is legally binding, but the energy efficiency target is so far not a legally binding requirement. And because of this, we're much more on track to meet the emissions target and the renewables target than we are to meet the energy savings target. Just to say that, as you see, so when we say energy efficiency target, it is actually a target to reduce energy consumption. The top blue ball is what our energy consumption would be in 2020 as the EU 27 member states if we would continue with our current patterns of consumption. If we take 20% of that, then that's the amount of consumption we're supposed to have in 2020, which is 1,474 million tonnes of oil equivalent. But actually, today, if we carry on as we are, even with the policies that the EU has in place, we will actually miss the target by half. We'll only be halfway to that point. So we have got a problem. And if we don't miss this target, we miss a lot of important benefits. I mentioned already the emissions reduction impacts, but the European Commission has estimated that if we meet this target, we could save 200 billion euros per year, every year, even after the cost of making the investments in energy efficiency. And that they estimate about 1,000 euros per household in savings. So that's quite attractive. Also, just from the point of view of the competitiveness of the EU and as a business opportunity, HSBC, the bank, has estimated that energy efficiency technologies and services is a really growing and exciting area because all countries need to think about how they can reduce their energy use. This market will be worth potentially $1.4 trillion in 2020, and the EU could have a share of about 28% of that in the year 2020 if we put in place the investments needed to meet this 20% target. Also, in particular sectors such as the building sector, the potential for creating jobs is very big. It's estimated that across the EU it could make 400,000 jobs, at least net jobs, that is, that's even jobs after the loss of other jobs in sectors that may reduce. Now, this one is another one that is of particular consideration in some countries. The EU spends an awful lot of money on importing energy. A lot of it from Russia, not all of it, but a lot of it. And in fact, it's quite unstable because by the year 2020, it's expected that we will be 93% dependent on imports for our oil use and 76% for our gas use. However, if we reduce how much energy we need to use, then obviously our dependence on external suppliers is quite a lot less. And then this is particularly an issue, for example, in the UK, where I come from. There are lots and lots of people who don't like even windmills. They think they're ugly and they take up, they block the view. And so even though in terms of emissions, renewable energies are not such a bad idea, the costs and the appearance of the energy infrastructure is something that it would be good to minimise, and we need less if we use less energy. And then there are also social considerations for reducing energy use by means of making houses more comfortable and better insulated. And there is evidence that, in fact, people who are not able to heat their homes properly, there are many negative consequences in terms of educational attainment, in terms of income, in terms of mental health. So this is really something that has benefits in almost every area of society. Now, in fact, because the benefits are so widespread, it's not just environmental NGOs who are excited about energy efficiency. And in Brussels, we have set up a coalition for energy savings, which includes people from a wide range of sectors. There are environmental NGOs, but there are also insulation manufacturers and glass manufacturers, producers of combined heat and power. There are businesses like Philips and Siemens and Schneider Electric are members of this coalition, and the idea was that renewable energies were doing a lot better in terms of their advocacy efforts to get policies to promote renewable energies. But energy efficiency, we were somewhat behind. And one of the reasons that renewables are doing very well is that actually the companies and the associations have got together and have got very active and are lobbying the EU, are lobbying their national governments for good, strong policies to promote renewable energy. And on energy efficiency, this hasn't really happened so much. And so we thought we would try and create a similarly strong lobby force on energy efficiency, and actually it is starting to work. And I think this is one recommendation that I would make to those of you who are interested in energy efficiency as a business opportunity or as for environmental reasons. The power of working together to influence the policies is actually very, very helpful. This is just an example of an advert that this coalition has put into one of the main newspapers in Brussels to demonstrate that energy efficiency actually is effectively an energy source. It's one of the cheapest, cleanest, safest ways of meeting our energy needs. It's reducing how much we need to use. So why has the EU not done very well at meeting this target for 20% energy savings? Well, part of the reason, of course, is that the opportunities for reducing energy use are very widely spread across the different sectors. It's not like you can just do one or two big projects and then it's done. There are energy saving opportunities in transport, in buildings, in the energy sector, and as you see from this graph, the red part is the part of the available potential for reducing consumption that has not been accessed yet. And so the biggest areas where there is a potential, an untapped potential for energy efficiency is in residential buildings and in the energy sector. And so now I will just say a bit about what the EU had tried to do previously to tap these potentials. It had a whole set of different bits of legislation. It still has a set of different bits of legislation. As I mentioned, there's this 20% target, but it's not binding. But it did have a particular directive on buildings, as you may know. This directive is quite good for new buildings. It says that in 2019 for public buildings and 2020 for all other buildings, they will have to be nearly zero energy, which basically means that they will be very efficient and the energy that they do use will need to come from on-site renewables. So this is going to be very good, but of course new buildings are only a very small proportion of the buildings that we have, about 1%, I think. So we need to do something about the existing buildings, and this directive doesn't really do very much for that. It sets minimum standards for when buildings are renovated, what level of efficiency they should reach, but it doesn't mandate anybody to actually do these renovations. Then there is another directive which is on products and appliances. This is the Eco-Design Directive, which works together with the Energy Labelling Directive. Now, the idea here is to set minimum energy performance standards for all different products like washing machines, televisions, light bulbs, boilers, and the idea is that gradually the least efficient models will be phased off the bottom of the market. And at the same time, there are energy labels, that colourful label with all of the stripes, coloured stripes, which an A, B, C, D level of energy efficiency, and that will direct consumers to the most efficient products. So that is quite useful in that particular sector, but obviously it only covers certain part of the energy using domain. Then we had certain provisions on transport and certain provisions on combined heat and power, but none of them have actually delivered that much yet. And this is why the new Energy Efficiency Directive has been developed. It was first proposed by the European Commission in June of last year, and this, when it was first proposed, we called it the mother of all directives because it's massive. It covers many different sectors on both energy supply and energy end use. And it was negotiated over the past year and a bit, and then it was finally agreed, well, basically, it's been finally formally approved in the last month, and it will now enter into force in November, so next month. After which, national governments will have 18 months, so a year and a half, to put the provisions of the directive into national law. And this is where the sort of big opportunity for Lithuania comes in. So what is in this directive? And I apologise to those of you that already know all of this, but as mentioned, the 20% target is not legally binding. However, this directive does put into law for the first time this figure, 1,474 million tonnes of oil equivalent, which is to be how much energy Europe uses in the year 2020, which is actually, on a global scale, quite progressive and quite exciting that 27 countries have agreed that their energy use will be this much, or this little. Underneath that, member states will have to set their own choice of national target. So what we had actually argued for this 1,474 million tonnes of oil equivalent to be broken down into an amount for each member state that would be then a legally binding requirement on that country. That was not accepted, so now it's just up to the member states what they want their own target to be. And that is something Lithuania will have to decide its target in April of next year and submit that to the European Commission. And then in 2014, the European Commission will take a look at all of these national targets that have been submitted and see if they add up to the right number. And if they don't, and they're worried that the 20% target still won't be met, then they will put forward some proposals for further measures or possibly more strict targets. Besides the question of the overall target, there is a sub-target in the Energy Efficiency Directive, which we in the Coalition for Energy Savings and as NGOs believe is one of the main drivers that this directive will provide for greater progress on energy efficiency. Because governments will now be obliged to deliver 1.5% annual savings of energy each year. So that's not to say that every year they have to reduce their energy consumption by 1.5%, so it goes down, but it just means that every year they will have to deliver energy savings that mean that the energy they use in that year is 1.5% less than it would have been otherwise. So it's not a cap, which is something that industry was very worried about, energy-intensive industry and so on, but it is a reduction compared to what had been expected. Countries will deliver these energy savings by means of energy company obligation schemes. So that means that energy suppliers or energy distributors, the country can choose, will be required to deliver these savings to their customers each year. And we already have examples in several countries in the EU where this happens. So Denmark, the UK, France, Italy and Flanders, which is a region of Belgium, not yet a country by itself, although it wants to be. They all have these schemes which obliges the energy companies to provide this. And the exciting thing about this is it forces energy companies to start thinking in terms of not just how can I make money by selling as much energy as possible to my customers, but how can I deliver to my customers what they actually want. When I turn on my radiator, I don't think, oh, I want lots of gas. I think that I want my room to be nice and warm. And the warmth, the fact that your room is warm thanks to, yes, the delivery of gas or whatever, but also the fact that my walls don't leak and my windows don't leak, that is what I'm actually interested in having. And so the idea is to turn energy companies into energy service providers rather than just pure sellers of energy. And the hope is that these obligation schemes will start to help make that happen. So there are a number of details about this provision for the 1.5% target, so countries are encouraged to do these obligation schemes, but if they prefer, they can also do it through other means, so taxes or special financing schemes or regulations, basically anything they want. But it has to add up to this 1.5% total amount each year. And member states are supposed to tell the Commission by the end of this next year how they will meet this target. So whether they will do an obligation scheme or some other set of measures. Then another aspect of this directive that received a lot of attention during the negotiations was to have a 3% annual renovation rate for public buildings. And the idea here was that, firstly, public buildings, they're big, many of them are old and they need lots of renovation, and it can be sort of organised by public authorities. And this is a way to sort of get the market going and to draw attention to the fact that energy efficiency is a good idea. So it would have been a good idea, and it still is, and it's there in the directive, but it only applies to central government buildings. So originally it would have applied to schools and hospitals and things, but And any country that wants to can still make it apply to schools and hospitals and all sorts of buildings, but the minimum requirement is that you do your central government buildings, which in Germany is 12 buildings, so it's not actually the most radical provision ever, but it's still a start. More interestingly, member states are also going to be asked to prepare renovation roadmaps, so a long-term strategy for the renovation of their entire building stock. And this is interesting because it complements the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that I mentioned. Here it's actually going to show how people will be persuaded to renovate their buildings, or required to renovate their buildings, rather than just what standard the building should be renovated to. And these roadmaps should be submitted to the Commission by April 2014. So that's going to be a lot of work to prepare those, but it's also an excellent opportunity for intervening if you've ever experienced frustrations in why people aren't, responding to the possibility to renovate. Here is the chance to think of what policies could be helpful to achieve that, and to tell the government so that it's put into the roadmap. And one particular thing that may help is to set up financing facilities. And this is actually a requirement in the directive as well, that governments should set up, or should facilitate, so help the establishment of these financing facilities, the idea is that they would bring together funding from many different sources. So that could be European funds, like Estonia has used the structural funds from the European Union budget, or it could be auctioning revenues from the emissions trading system allowances, which will start to become available next year, or it could be just other money from the government budget that they decided to use, or it could be money from these obligation schemes where you could have asked the energy company to pay money into the fund rather than to carry out the work. But so lots of different possible sources of funding, if they would be put together and used as a way of leveraging private finance, so from commercial banks, this can be a way to make money more readily available for financing renovations of buildings. And then they can be sort of directed to useful projects. There's an example of this in the UK, again, called the Green Investment Bank. And the idea is that this provides a proper source of money for low-carbon infrastructure investment, so also renewables and so on, not just energy efficiency. But the idea is also that it helps to connect up the money with the projects, because often with energy efficiency, money has been available, but the project has not been forthcoming. So, and part of the reason that private investors are not interested is because the projects are too dispersed. If you're looking for a pension fund to invest, they won't be very interested in Mrs. Jones deciding to renovate her house as one little project. But if you put lots and lots and lots of Mrs. Joneses together, then it starts to become a scaled issue and something that's of interest. And that's something that these financing facilities could help to do, to aggregate the projects so that they are a more bankable proposition. So what else is in the directive? Well, large companies will be required to conduct energy audits every 4 years. The government will also have to make an assessment of the efficiency potential of their energy infrastructure and think of ways to improve it, and also to promote demand response, which is particularly interesting when we're starting to think about integrating more renewables into the grid. And then there are some provisions on combined heat and power and district heating. So all new, every time a new thermal power plant is to be built, or an industrial installation is to be built, or they are to be renovated, a cost-benefit analysis will have to be made of whether or not they should be equipped with combined heat and power technology. It's not then required that they do anything with the results of this analysis. That was another sort of outcome of the compromise of the negotiations, but the hope is that obviously if it's proved, if the analysis demonstrates that it would be cost effective to do this, then people would. And also electricity generated through these means would be given priority grid access and dispatch to the grid. So yeah, just a few other things in the directive. People will be required to eventually have smart meters so that they can see what their consumption is, and also their bills will have to be more informative than they have been previously. So they can actually see what their consumption is and make a comparison with the previous year. And this will have to be presented in a format that enables them to compare with other providers what they could have got. And then, yeah, the rest of it is so vague it's not even really worth talking about. So that's what's in the directive. Quite a lot of different things. And in the end, I mean, the idea of the directive was that it would close the gap. You remember that gap with the blue balls? We wanted to make it so that we actually would achieve the 20% target. Unfortunately, politics is politics, and the negotiations were very difficult, and in the end, the provisions in the directive are not as strong as we had hoped. And in fact, only about half of that gap to the target will be closed. So the directive will deliver about 15% savings by 2020. Having said that, we are expecting some more new eco-design standards for boilers and water heaters, which are very big users of energy. With these and some new standards for car efficiency, probably we might make savings of 17% by 2020, but that is still not meeting the target, which is a shame because it puts us not quite on track to the 2050 objective. And it also, the problem with energy investments is that for energy infrastructure, they're very long. If you invest in a power plant or some grid infrastructure, it's going to be there for 40 years or more. And so the decisions we're making today actually really have an impact on where we're going to be in 2050. And so we need to be able to know with confidence that we will be using less energy by given dates, so we don't build more energy infrastructure than we need to. And this is why clearer signals that we were actually going to reduce our energy use would be helpful. But I did mention the Commission will make this assessment in 2014 of whether whether they think we'll meet the target. Obviously, it looks like we won't, in which case they will have to come forward with some additional measures, but we have yet to see what those will be. And in the meantime, we just need to make sure that as much is made as possible of the opportunity that this directive provides. As I said, it will enter force already next month, which means that governments have the rest of this year, all of next year, and the first bit of 2014 to write it into national laws. Although there are some objectives before that that they must fulfil, so they must submit their national target in April, and then in November next year they must submit their plans for how they will meet the 1.5% target. So really the next few months are really critical for getting your ideas across to the people in the ministry who will be responsible for transposing this directive. And I mentioned that the Coalition for Energy Savings works together. We're in the process of preparing a kind of guidebook on the directive, so some recommendations for what it would be useful for people to ask for from their governments to get the most out of the directive. It's quite a big project, but we hope to have it ready by January. And if anybody's interested, I can disseminate that when it is ready. I mean, broadly speaking, of course, NGOs want to save the world. That's always what we want to do. But from this directive, we hope that we will reduce the EU's energy use quite a lot. But more functionally, we hope that there are things in this directive, so the energy company obligation schemes, if they happen, that will, for example, that will help to open up the market for energy services, so that it really starts to become an exciting part of the market to invest in, to be the guy that goes around and audits buildings and provides renovations of them, and that gets involved in developing new efficient technologies for industrial processes and design strategies to get more efficient public transport into your towns and so on. All of these things just need a bit of a kick. And particularly in the field of energy renovation, it's about mobilising finance, creating demand so that people actually use the finance that's there, and at the same time having a workforce that is equipped to do the work, because obviously renovating a building to a high standard is not something that you can just do like that. And this is the sort of exciting thing about this directive in a way, because it offers drivers on lots of different fronts. So if it's all done together in a sensible and considered fashion, then we could actually address all of these barriers at the same time. another sort of part of our vision is that eventually energy efficiency would be really regarded on an equal footing with energy supply. So when we're thinking about how we meet our energy needs, obviously if you think about meeting energy demand, one way to do it is to build supply, another way is to bring the demand down, and so far there tends to be a bit more of a focus on energy supply because it's big and it's glamorous and it's geopolitics and it's building a nice big power station that you can cut a ribbon in front of and so on. But we want energy efficiency to be the first principle of the way that a country thinks about its energy use. So first you bring that down the demand, then you fill part of the demand with renewables, and then, or as much as you can, and then whatever is left you would use fossil fuels as efficiently as you could. I don't know if this works in Lithuanian, but we've just commissioned some colleagues, some friends from Friends of the Earth and I have commissioned these cartoons. So here you, well, hopefully it's obvious, but you have, in the future, people will be looking at some of these ugly energy infrastructure items and thinking that they don't need so many of them because there's so much wonderful energy efficiency around. Then, do I have time to just say a few words about residential retrofits, or is it better if I stop?
Say 3 minutes, fine.
Okay. So, yeah, anybody that's ever considered how do you get houses renovated? Because as we saw in that graph with the red bars, that's a really massive part of the energy saving potential. Well, it's a really tricky problem because there are so many different barriers. If you think about, first of all, the householders, will they want to renovate their house? Well, possibly not, because it's quite a big hassle. You have to clear out your loft, you have to have builders in your house for days on end. What are you going to do? It is also, even if it will eventually pay back, it costs quite a lot up front. And even if they have the spare money in their monthly wage packet, which many people don't, I know I don't, then you might want to spend it on something else, like a holiday or a new wardrobe or something else. And also it's just a bit complicated and messy, like where do you go, who can do this, who can provide it? Then from the point of view of the people that are providing the service, well, there actually aren't that many of them, people that offer energy efficiency services, partly because there is so little demand from consumers, so it doesn't seem like that much of an interesting proposition. And although there are models where the energy companies or efficiency businesses themselves can provide the money which then the consumers pay back through the reductions in their energy bills, that requires these providers to have spare money themselves to initially invest in it. And while in principle they could get this money from other sources, from investors, when investors think nobody's really interested in this, it's not a very safe area to develop the business model that we would need to work in this, and as mentioned, it's a very, very fragmented market. So any programme needs to address all of these different barriers at the same time. So yeah, and this, as I mentioned, is why this directive and the development of these renovation roadmaps and the development of a country's idea about how it will deliver this 1.5% target is a very interesting moment to think about. And just to give a bit of some examples, really, I mean, there are different types of consumer. There are people who have a lot of money and could be persuaded to invest in renovating their home if only it were just made obvious to them how they would do it, and if there was enough of an incentive. And there is evidence that for these sorts of consumers, just perhaps a nice cashback bonus or a very low interest loan could be interesting. One example comes from Germany. You may have heard of the KfW bank, the public bank. So they did a scheme which, the figures I have are from 2010, but they invested 8.7 billion euros in a renovation scheme where if you renovated a building, either a public building or a residential building, to the KfW efficiency house standard, so a fairly high level of efficiency standard, then you would get a 3% subsidised loan for this, and once it was completed you would get a 12.5%, well, a rebate basically, so a cash handout of 12.5% of the value of the loan for having done this. And they managed to get 1.5 million homes done in that period of that programme, which is better than the 6 that Linus tells me were managed in Lithuania with the multi-apartment programme. And then similarly in France, 0 interest loans are available to people that are buying their house for the first time if it is above the minimum standards of efficiency. And if you're undertaking major renovations, you get a 0 interest loan of €30,000 to do those investments. So this is sort of looking at the relatively aware consumers who know that energy efficiency is a good idea and they just need a bit of a kick up the bum. There are other people who probably know less about whether it's a good idea or not, and they probably need quite a lot more input in the form of even lower interest loans or even grants, so actual free money to do the investments. And then there's another group of consumers who are the very hard ones to reach, who probably would never renovate their home because of things like hassle and so on, even if the money was completely made available free to them. And for these groups of consumers, you probably need to eventually move to things like making it mandatory that when a building changes hands, it be brought up to a certain efficiency standard, which is obviously quite hard to achieve, but this is where it's interesting from the point of view of these long-term renovation strategies. If a government is really now thinking about how can I renovate my entire building stock up to 2050, then obviously you start with the easy ones first, the sort of 15% of the population that you just need to kind of encourage with a bit of a handout, and then you eventually look at the more sort of full-on interventions that would be needed to make other parts of the consumer market do their home. I think I will stop there.